Medieval peasants ate bread every day, yet modern bread is making people bloated, inflamed, and sick. What changed? The daily loaf. In 1323, a French peasant family in the Loire Valley consumed approximately 3 pounds of bread per day, not as a side dish, not as an occasional carbohydrate, as the foundation of every meal. Breakfast was bread soaked in ale or milk. Lunch was bread with onions, cheese, or whatever vegetables were available. Dinner was bread trenchers, thick slices that served as edible plates, soaked with stew or pottage. By modern standards, this was a carbohydrate load that should have left medieval people diabetic, obese, and metabolically destroyed. Yet, the archaeological and historical record tells a different story. Skeletal remains from medieval populations show relatively low rates of the metabolic diseases we associate with high carbohydrate diets. Dental cavities were less common than in modern populations despite no toothbrushes or fluoride. Average height, a reliable indicator of childhood nutrition, held steady or even increased in many regions during periods when bread consumption was highest. The peasants eating 3 pounds of bread daily weren't suffering epidemic obesity or diabetes. They were, by the standards of their time and circumstances, reasonably healthy. The bread they ate bears almost no resemblance to what sits in plastic bags on supermarket shelves today. The differences aren't subtle variations in recipe or technique. They're fundamental alterations in grain, milling, fermentation, and chemistry that transformed bread from a nutritionally complex whole food into something closer to sweetened foam. Understanding what medieval bread actually was and what happened to it requires looking at every stage of production from seed to table. The grain itself. Walk through a medieval grain field in July and you'd see wheat varieties that have largely vanished from commercial agriculture. Emmer, einkorn, spelt, ancient wheats with tough husks, lower yields, and tall, sturdy stalks that resisted lodging in wind and rain. These weren't carefully engineered crops bred for maximum protein content or uniform height. They were land races, local varieties adapted over centuries to specific soils and climates, saved seed to seed by farming families who selected for reliability, flavor, and how well the grain worked in their particular bread-making process. The gluten structure in these older wheats was fundamentally different from modern varieties. Gluten, the protein network that gives bread its structure, consists primarily of 2 protein types, gliadins and glutenins. Medieval wheat varieties had lower overall gluten content, typically 12 to 14% protein by weight, and a different ratio of gliadins to glutenins. This created dough that was less elastic, less able to trap gas bubbles, and less likely to form the tight, strong gluten networks that characterize modern bread. Modern wheat, by contrast, has been systematically bred for high protein content, often 15 to 18%, with glutenin profiles specifically selected to create strong, extensible dough. This happened gradually through the 20th century as bakers and millers demanded wheat that could withstand mechanical mixing, tolerate fast fermentation, and produce high-rising loaves reliably. The wheat variety Marquise, introduced in 1911, was one of the first major high-gluten cultivars. It spread rapidly because it made commercial baking easier. By the 1960s, semi-dwarf wheat varieties with even higher protein content and stronger gluten dominated global production. This wasn't a sinister conspiracy. It was agricultural economics responding to industrial baking. But the consequence was wheat that behaves very differently in the human digestive system. The tight gluten networks in modern bread are harder to break down. The proteins themselves may be more immunogenic, more likely to trigger inflammatory responses in sensitive individuals. And the breeding process, focused entirely on baking performance and yield, paid no attention whatsoever to digestibility, micronutrient content, or how the grain interacted with fermentation. Medieval wheat also grew in different soil conditions. Before synthetic fertilizers, fields were fertilized with manure, compost, and through crop rotation that included nitrogen-fixing legumes. This created grain with different mineral profiles, often higher in magnesium, zinc, and selenium, because the soil biology was more diverse and complex. Modern wheat, grown in chemical-intensive monoculture, may have higher yields, but the individual kernels are often less nutritionally dense. This is the dilution effect. As yield increases, the concentration of minerals per gram of grain decreases. Stone grinding versus roller mills. The transformation of grain into flour was a slow, cool process in medieval mills. Stone mills, typically powered by water or wind, used massive circular stones, often 3 to 4 feet in diameter, weighing hundreds of pounds. The lower stone remained stationary while the upper stone rotated, creating a gap of perhaps 1/16 of an inch where grain was crushed and ground. This took time. A watermill might process 30 to 50 pounds of grain per hour, depending on water flow and stone condition. The slow grinding kept temperatures low. Friction generated heat, but the mass of the stone and the relatively slow rotation speed, usually 30 to 40 revolutions per minute, meant the flour rarely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This mattered because wheat contains enzymes, oils, and vitamins that are heat sensitive. The wheat germ, rich in vitamin E and healthy fats, stayed intact and viable. The oils didn't oxidize. The enzymes that would later aid fermentation remained active. Stone milling also produced flour with a coarse, irregular particle-size distribution. Some particles were fine powder. Others were larger fragments that included bits of bran and germ. This wasn't a defect. It was the natural result of crushing rather than shearing, and it meant the flour retained more of the original grain structure. Importantly, stone milling didn't separate the bran, germ, and endosperm. Everything went through together, creating true whole grain flour by default. The roller mill changed everything. Introduced in the 1870s and rapidly adopted throughout Europe and North America, roller mills used pairs of steel cylinders rotating at different speeds to shear grain apart. The process was faster, more efficient, and crucially, it allowed precise separation of the grain's components. The bran, the outer fiber-rich layer, could be sifted out and sold as animal feed. The germ, the nutrient-dense embryo containing oils, vitamins, and minerals, was removed because its fats caused flour to go rancid during storage. What remained was the endosperm, the starchy interior that consists almost entirely of carbohydrate and gluten proteins. This refined white flour became the standard for commercial bread. It had advantages from a manufacturing perspective. It stored indefinitely without refrigeration. It produced uniform, predictable dough. It created the soft, fine crumb texture that consumers came to expect. But nutritionally, it was gutted. The fiber was gone. The B vitamins were gone. The minerals were gone. The healthy fats were gone. What remained was rapidly digestible starch and gluten. By the 1940s, governments recognized this as a public health problem. Enrichment programs were established, adding back synthetic versions of some B vitamins and iron to refined flour. This prevented outright deficiency diseases like beriberi, but it didn't restore the dozens of other compounds, phytochemicals, trace minerals, fiber, that were lost in refining. Medieval flour, stone ground and whole, didn't need enrichment. It was inherently complete. The fermentation factor. A medieval baker starting a batch of bread on Monday morning wouldn't finish until Tuesday or Wednesday, not because the process was complicated, but because proper fermentation couldn't be rushed. Most medieval bread was leavened with sourdough, a living culture of wild yeast and lactobacilli bacteria captured from the air, the grain, and the baker's environment. This culture worked slowly, taking 12 to 24 hours or more to raise dough adequately. During this long fermentation, profound chemical changes occurred. The bacteria in sourdough produce lactic acid and acetic acid, lowering the dough's pH to around 3.8 to 4.0. This acidic environment activates enzymes called phytases, which break down phytic acid, a compound in grain that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium, making them unavailable for absorption. Whole grain flour is high in phytic acid, which is why eating large amounts of unfermented whole grain can actually impair mineral nutrition. But sourdough fermentation reduces phytic acid by 60 to 90%, unlocking those minerals for absorption. The bacteria also begin breaking down gluten proteins. They produce proteolytic enzymes that cleave the long protein chains into shorter peptides and amino acids. This doesn't eliminate gluten. Sourdough bread still contains gluten and isn't safe for celiacs, but it makes the gluten more digestible and less likely to cause problems for people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Studies have shown that bread fermented for 12 hours or more produces fewer symptoms in sensitive individuals compared to bread given just 2 hours of fermentation with commercial yeast. The wild yeast in sourdough also metabolizes sugars differently than commercial yeast. They work more slowly, producing carbon dioxide at a steady rate that doesn't exhaust the dough's fermentable sugars in the first few hours. This means the finished bread has a lower glycemic index. It raises blood sugar more gradually compared to quickly fermented bread. Medieval peasants eating sourdough bread experienced slower, more sustained energy release rather than the spike and crash pattern associated with modern refined bread. Medieval bakers maintained their sourdough starters carefully, often for decades or generations. A portion of dough was held back from each batch, stored in a cool place, and used to start the next batch. The culture adapted to the local grain, water, and conditions, developing a stable ecosystem of yeasts and bacteria uniquely suited to that bakery. When a baker moved to a new town or gave a daughter a portion of starter as part of her dowry, they were transferring living biology that carried the literal taste and character of home. Commercial yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, isolated and cultured as a pure strain, became widely available in the late 19th century. It revolutionized baking. Bread could now rise in 2 to 3 hours instead of 24. Production could be scaled, standardized, scheduled. But the trade-off was the loss of bacterial fermentation. Commercial yeast produces carbon dioxide quickly, but it doesn't acidify the dough, doesn't break down phytic acid, and doesn't pre-digest gluten. Modern commercial bread uses commercial yeast almost exclusively, with fermentation times measured in minutes or hours, not days. The additives arrive. Open a package of commercial sliced bread and read the ingredients. You'll find 15 to 20 items, many of them unfamiliar. Medieval bread had 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. Sometimes not even salt if the household couldn't afford it. The contrast reveals how radically bread's purpose has shifted from food to product. Modern bread contains dough conditioners, chemicals like datem, sodium stearoyl lactylate, and azodicarbonamide that modify gluten structure, allowing dough to tolerate mechanical mixing and rapid processing. These compounds weren't added because bread needed them. They were added because industrial production needed them. They allow bread to be mixed in giant machines, shaped by automated lines, and baked on tight schedules that maximize factory throughput. Preservatives extend shelf life far beyond what's natural for a moist, perishable food. Calcium propionate prevents mold. Sorbic acid inhibits yeast. These allow bread to sit in plastic bags on shelves for weeks without spoiling. Medieval bread went stale in a day or two and moldy within a week unless kept in very dry conditions. This wasn't a flaw. It was the natural behavior of food made from grain, water, and biological leavening. Modern bread that stays soft for 2 weeks isn't superior. It's embalmed, Sugar and high fructose corn syrup appear in most commercial breads, often in surprisingly large amounts. Check the label. 3 to 5 grams of sugar per slice isn't uncommon. Medieval bread made with sourdough had no added sugar. The slight sweetness, if any, came from the maltose released when enzymes broke down starch during fermentation. Added sugar in modern bread serves multiple purposes. It feeds commercial yeast for faster rising. It masks the flat flavor of refined flour, and it triggers the sweet preference that drives consumption. But it also spikes the glycemic load, turning bread from a slow-burning fuel into something closer to cake. Vegetable oils and hydrogenated fats create soft texture and extend freshness. Medieval bread relied on the small amount of fat naturally present in whole grain flour. Lean bread, made with just flour, water and salt, had a chewy, hearty texture. Enriched breads for special occasions might include butter, eggs or milk, but these were luxuries. Modern sandwich bread includes soybean oil or palm oil in nearly every formula, contributing to a higher calorie density and a softer, almost spongy texture that Americans have learned to associate with good bread. The cumulative effect of these additives isn't well studied. Individual compounds may be generally recognized as safe by regulatory standards, but nobody knows what happens when you consume 15 different stabilizers, emulsifiers, and preservatives daily for decades. Medieval people faced plenty of health challenges, infections, injuries, malnutrition in bad years, but they weren't conducting a multi-generational experiment in consuming industrially modified grain products with ingredient lists that read like chemistry exams. Speed and temperature. Industrial bread baking operates on timescales that would baffle a medieval baker. The Chorleywood bread process, developed in Britain in 1961 and now used worldwide, can produce finished bread from raw ingredients in under 3.5 hours. The dough is mixed at high speed with intense mechanical energy, incorporating air and developing gluten in minutes rather than hours. Chemical oxidizers replace the slow gluten, strengthening that traditionally happened during fermentation. The dough goes directly into pans, proofs for less than an hour, and bakes. This speed is economically efficient: more loaves per hour, less labor, lower costs, higher profits. But it eliminates the fermentation time that made bread digestible. The phytic acid remains intact. The gluten proteins aren't broken down. The starches aren't pre-digested by bacterial enzymes. What emerges from industrial ovens is technically bread. It's made from wheat flour, it's leavened, it's baked. But biochemically, it's a different substance than what medieval people ate. The high-speed mixing also changes gluten structure. Traditional hand kneading or slow mechanical mixing develops gluten gradually, creating a network with moderate strength and extensibility. High-speed mixing with intense mechanical energy creates gluten networks that are very strong but also more tight and resistant. This might be why modern bread seems harder to digest for some people. The gluten structure is literally more robust and requires more enzymatic work to break down in the gut. Baking temperatures matter too. Medieval bread ovens, heated by burning wood inside the baking chamber, then sweeping out the coals, operated at lower temperatures than modern deck ovens. An experienced baker could judge heat by holding a hand inside or by how quickly a handful of flour browned when tossed on the floor. This usually resulted in baking temperatures around 450 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than the 450-500 degrees common in modern commercial baking. The slower, cooler bake meant more time for the Maillard reaction, the browning that creates complex flavors and makes crust crispy, and less chance of creating advanced glycation end products, compounds formed at very high temperatures that may contribute to inflammation. The gut connection. Recent microbiome research has revealed something medieval people couldn't have known but experienced daily. Bread made with long fermentation feeds beneficial gut bacteria, in ways that modern bread doesn't. The fiber in whole-grain sourdough bread acts as a prebiotic, providing fuel for bacteria species like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus that produce short-chain fatty acids, compounds that reduce inflammation, strengthen the intestinal barrier, and even influence mood and metabolism. But the benefit goes beyond fiber content. The fermentation products themselves, the organic acids, the partially broken down proteins, the modified starches, appear to interact with gut bacteria in complex ways. Studies comparing sourdough bread to commercially yeasted bread have found that sourdough produces lower postprandial glucose and insulin responses, even when the fiber content is identical. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but it likely involves both the direct effects of bacterial metabolites and indirect effects on how quickly the bread is digested and absorbed. Medieval people eating sourdough bread daily were essentially consuming a probiotic food, not in the supplement sense, but in the traditional fermented food sense. The bread itself contained living bacteria and yeast at the moment of baking. While most of these microorganisms died in the oven, they left behind metabolites and cell components that influenced gut health, and because everyone in a household ate from the same loaf, made with the same starter culture, they were sharing a microbial ecosystem. This might have contributed to microbiome stability within families and communities, though that's speculative. Modern bread, fermented quickly with pure commercial yeast and no bacterial culture, provides none of these benefits. It's sterile, uniform, and nutritionally one-dimensional. The fiber in whole grain commercial bread, if it's present at all, helps with digestive transit, but it lacks the fermentation products and resistant starches that feed beneficial bacteria. White bread is even worse, essentially pure starch and gluten, stripped of fiber, rapidly digested, providing quick calories, but nothing that supports long-term metabolic health. This might explain some of the correlation between increased bread consumption and metabolic disease in modern populations. It's not bread per se that's the problem. It's industrial bread, quickly fermented, refined, additive-laden, that our digestive systems struggle to process efficiently. Medieval bread, despite being the dietary staple, didn't cause these problems because it was fundamentally different food. The ash content issue: medieval bakers didn't know about ash content, but they experienced its effects. Ash content, the mineral residue left after burning flour at high temperature, indicates how much bran and germ remain in the flour. Stone ground whole wheat flour has an ash content around 1.5 to 2.0%. Refined white flour has an ash content below 0.5%. The difference represents all the minerals, vitamins, and fiber that were removed during milling. Those minerals weren't incidental. Magnesium, present in the bran and germ, is essential for over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, including insulin regulation and blood pressure control. Most modern diets are marginally deficient in magnesium, and switching from whole grain to refined grain is a major contributor. Medieval peasants eating stone-ground whole grain bread got substantial magnesium with every meal. Zinc, also concentrated in the bran and germ, supports immune function and wound healing. Iron, particularly non-heme iron from plant sources, is better absorbed when phytic acid has been broken down by fermentation, which happened automatically in sourdough bread, but doesn't happen in modern bread. B vitamins, especially thiamine, niacin, and folate, are abundant in whole grain, but largely absent from refined flour unless synthetically added back. The medieval diet wasn't optimally balanced by modern standards. Meat was scarce, fresh vegetables were seasonal, and malnutrition was a real risk during famines. But in normal years, when bread was plentiful, that bread provided a nutritional foundation that supported health. It wasn't just calories, it was a complex package of macronutrients, micronutrients, fiber, and fermentation products that work together to nourish the body. Modern refined bread provides calories efficiently, perhaps too efficiently given obesity rates, but it's nutritionally hollow. The enrichment process adds back a handful of synthetic vitamins, but it doesn't restore the dozens of compounds that were removed. People eating white bread as a staple are essentially consuming empty carbohydrates, which spike blood sugar, provide minimal satiety, and contribute to the chronic metabolic stress that underlies diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. The peasant's advantage. There's an irony here. Medieval peasants ate bread out of necessity, not choice. It was cheap, filling, and could be made from grain they grew themselves. Meat, cheese, and other protein sources were expensive or scarce. Bread was survival food. Yet that survival food, by accident of traditional methods and pre-industrial ingredients, was nutritionally superior to the bread sold in modern supermarkets to affluent consumers who have infinite choices. The peasant's advantage was ignorance of a sort. They didn't know about vitamins or glycemic index or gut microbiomes. They couldn't refine flour even if they wanted to. Stone mills don't separate bran efficiently, and there was no economic incentive to throw away edible parts of the grain. They couldn't make bread rise in 2 hours because they didn't have commercial yeast. The slow methods, the whole grain flour, the sourdough fermentation, these weren't conscious health choices. They were simply how bread was made with available technology and economics. But the result was bread that worked with human biology rather than against it. Bread that provided sustained energy, supported gut health, delivered essential minerals, and didn't trigger the inflammatory responses that plague modern grain-sensitive individuals. Medieval people had plenty of health problems. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high, infectious diseases were deadly. But metabolic disease, digestive disorders related to bread, and gluten sensitivity at modern rates, the evidence suggests these were rare. The artisan revival. Not all modern bread is industrial garbage. Over the past 30 years, artisan bakeries have revived traditional methods, producing bread that resembles medieval loaves far more than supermarket products. These bakeries mill their own flour, often from heritage wheat varieties. They ferment dough for 12 to 48 hours using sourdough cultures. They avoid additives, using only flour, water, and salt. The bread they produce isn't cheap. A loaf might cost $6 to $10, but it's real bread in the historical sense. People who claim they can't eat commercial bread often find they tolerate artisan sourdough without problems. This isn't placebo. It's the difference between industrially processed grain product and properly fermented whole food. The long fermentation breaks down the compounds that cause digestive distress. The whole grain flour provides fiber and minerals. The traditional methods create a food that human digestive systems evolved to handle. This revival proves that the knowledge isn't lost. Skilled bakers can still produce bread that burns slowly in the body, supports rather than undermines health, and tastes profoundly better than anything in a plastic bag. But it remains a niche market. The economics of modern food production favor speed, uniformity, and long shelf life over nutritional quality. Most bread consumed today is still industrial, still quickly fermented, still made from refined flour and chemical additives. Medieval peasants didn't have nutrition labels, food scientists, or health blogs. They didn't know about phytic acid, gluten sensitivity, or insulin resistance. What they had was bread made the only way they knew how: slow, whole, fermented. That bread sustained them through long days of physical labor, supported women through multiple pregnancies, nourished children through growth. It wasn't perfect. Famines happened, nutrition suffered in bad years, and no one's claiming medieval diets were optimal. But the bread itself, the daily staple, worked. Modern bread fails not because we lack knowledge or technology, but because we've optimized for the wrong things. We wanted bread that never goes stale, that rises in minutes, that costs next to nothing, that tastes sweet and soft and completely unlike the hearty, tangy loaves our ancestors ate. We got exactly that. And now we're sick, bloated, inflamed, metabolically stressed, from eating something that's barely recognizable as the food that sustained human civilization for thousands of years. The solution isn't complicated. It's slower milling, longer fermentation, whole grains, and time. Everything medieval bakers used by default. Everything modern production abandoned for profit. The bread that made people healthy is still possible to make. We've just forgotten why it mattered.